later. So with that, I'm going to start the recording and also introduce our speaker. So welcome everyone to Quantifying the Non-Market Benefits of Coastal Adaptation in Natural Infrastructure, Implications for Benefit Cost Analysis. Our speaker is Robert Johnston, who is the director of the George Perkins Marsh Institute and professor of economics at Clark University. He is also the editor of the journal Resource and Energy Economics. Professor Johnston is an environmental economist whose research addresses economic valuation, benefits transfer, and ecosystem services with an emphasis on aquatic and coastal systems. He has also conducted significant work in climate change adaptation. He is currently co-chair of the Ecosystem Sciences Science and Management Working Group of the NOAA Science Advisory Board and on the steering committee and Science Advisory Board of the Narragansett, maybe correct my pronunciation on that, Bay Estuary Program, and the Senior Advisory Board of the Connecticut Sea Grant Program. He's a past member of the USDA Science Advisory Board and has served on multiple U.S. national. His publications include multiple books and approximately 100 journal articles on the use of economics to inform environmental management. So take us away.
All right, so hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, those bios always seem ridiculously long when you hear them read alive. So anyway, so what I wanted to do today was just to give a first kind of a very kind of brief flyover of how environmental economists, environmental natural resource economists think about the economics of coastal adaptation, what we do when we try to measure benefits and costs, and maybe if there's an overarching theme of this, it's that sometimes benefits and costs that are measured by economists aren't typically what people expect they will be. So, and then I'm going to highlight these using a couple examples from different sorts of coastal adaptation contexts, right? So, okay. So first slide, just some background, right? So, we've got rising seas, increased incidence and severity of coastal storms. So a lot of areas, coastal areas, towns, states, whatever, are worried about what to do about that, right? I mean, lots of options are possible. You can armor your shoreline, build riprap, bulkheads, whatever. In some cases, you might be able to nourish beaches to provide protection, restore salt marshes, what have you. There's all sorts of different things you can do. And every single one of those involves trade-offs, right? Benefits, costs imposed on different people. And so the broader question is, well, what can economics tell us about the benefits and costs and perhaps the optimality of different adaptation options in different areas? Obviously, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. And how do we know whether an adaptation option, whatever it is, building a seawall, restoring a salt marsh, perhaps retreating from the coast by pulling out homes, whether the economic benefits of that, whatever it is, outweigh the costs, right? So given that there's so many things we can do, how can we balance the benefits and costs and determine, essentially provide guidance to folks on what they should do? And as part of this, one of the kind of the themes that keep showing up in the literature and in newspapers and the media is, well, how do we balance the protection of built versus natural capital, homes, roads, water treatment plants, things that we built, versus natural capital, beaches, wetlands, dunes, and other things that we care about and provide values, ecosystem services. So that's kind of the background. As I mentioned before, obviously there's no one-size-fits-all approach, right? So here, there's just some close-in, remotely sensed images of two towns that we studied in Connecticut, Old Saybrook and Waterford, right? And those are very close together. They're only about maybe 10 miles apart. And so we're looking at the western side of each one as it might be impacted by, say, a hurricane. In this case, it's a prediction of what would flood under Category 3 hurricane. And you can see in Old Saybrook, where that blue area is, the predicted flooded area, a lot of little homes, closely packed homes, are going to be flooded. Where in Waterford, most of the area that would be flooded is either sparsely populated or is in open space areas, right? So that you might think, well, the things that might be optimal in one community are not likely to be optimal in another. Okay, so where I want to start in terms of getting down into the weeds a little bit is just the idea that sometimes, and actually it's more than sometimes, good decisions can be hindered by misguided assumptions or misunderstanding of what an economic benefit and cost really is, right? The most common thing that we see over and over again is the idea that somehow a damage cost represents a valid measure of an economic benefit. For example, if we can prevent a damage cost that might be estimated by some kind of an engineering model, that really is the measure of the benefit of our adaptation. And generally, that's just not the case. And if you do use damage costs as your primary metric of estimating, say, the benefits of protecting a coastal area, then effectively what you're going to do is automatically give preference to protecting built stuff, even if protecting natural stuff, in effect, is more valuable to society. So, and in doing that, giving automatic priority to protecting the built stuff, right, homes, infrastructure, market goods and services, can lead to policies that actually make society worse off, right? Because we're ignoring the benefits that we get from, say, beaches where people go to recreate, or salt marshes that provide habitat and support fisheries and all sorts of things. And obviously, a successful adaptation program is going to balance all sorts of benefits and costs, not just the ones associated with, say, damage to something you built. So, and this is basically just talking about what I mentioned, right? So so one of the most commonly cited estimates of economic cost due to coastal hazards, and and conversely, the benefit of preventing that say the flooding, would be that you've eliminated damage costs to homes and infrastructure. And so if we reduce or avoid those costs, that's typically, at least in the media, when politicians talk about this stuff, as reported as an economic benefit of adaptation. We're avoiding those damages. And at a certain level, that seems reasonable, right? But you really want to think about, in terms of what this really means to society, what those damage costs actually are, right? So really what they are is saying, okay, we've got some model, we're predicting where a flood's going to go, and we're predicting the amount of damage to a built asset. And the damage cost is simply what it would cost to fix it back to where it was before. So it's a repair cost, right? The problem is that the cost of repairing something is not the same as the benefit of that thing, right? So think about a good example is, imagine you have an old beat up car, right? And something goes bad, say the transmission fails, right? You take it to your mechanic, and the mechanic says, boy, that's really expensive. That's a $4,000 repair, right? And then you think, well, but my car is only worth $500, so I'm not going to spend $4,000 on that repair because it's not worth it to me. The value is what it's worth to you, right? So the cost, so using damage costs is akin to saying the value of that car to you is $4,000 because it's going to cost $4,000 to fix it, right? And that's obviously ridiculous if you think about it that way, right? The cost of doing something is not the same as the value of something, right? We balance costs and benefits when we decide what to do. So taking that into the damage cost due to, say, flooding or natural hazards realm, again, a cartoon example, let's imagine we have a rarely used bridge to nowhere, right? Nobody uses it, right? In my cartoon example, say it's damaged by a flood or a storm. Imagine that repairing this bridge would cost $100 million. Is the social benefit of protecting this bridge really $100 million? Well, no, because no one uses it, right? If the bridge is gone, nobody cares, right? Nobody uses it. So the value of that bridge or protecting that bridge might actually be close to zero, right? Now, obviously, that's an extreme example, but it's to make a point. On the other hand, you could have a dirt road that costs almost nothing to repair, but it's heavily used, say, by rural residents. They use it to evacuate, and they use, that road is necessary for emergency vehicles to get through, right? Well, imagine that repairing that road would cost $20,000 just to put dirt back on and repress it down. Is the benefit of protecting that road only $20,000? Well, no, probably not. It could be much, much larger if by protecting that road, you've now saved, prevented a loss of life and whatever. So the point is that the cost of doing something or the cost of repairing something is not the same as the value of something. And what damage costs simply are is the cost of repairing something, which doesn't necessarily tell us anything about what that's worth, right? So that's kind of one thing that is worth thinking about. So then the question is, so we talked about what benefits and costs aren't, or at least one example of them, right? It's not to say that you might not want to measure them. If you're an insurance company, you really care about damage costs because that's what you have to pay, right? So if you're whatever, if you're Prudential, damage costs are really what you care about, right? If you're FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency in the U.S., well, you probably care about that because that's what you might have to cover in an emergency. That's not the same as economic benefits and cost to society. So, broadly speaking, economic benefits and costs don't necessarily equate to money flows in markets, right? And again, that's kind of a common mistake that people make. They assume that economics is all about money trading hands. Economic activity, dollars passed between different people buying and selling, doesn't necessarily equal economic benefit. Imagine that we were all in a room. I took $1 out of my pocket and handed it to one person, and that person handed it to the next person, and we just passed that dollar around the room, right? That's a lot of economic activity. That dollar's bounced around a lot, but no economic benefit has been created, right? At the end, the dollar comes back to me, and nobody's better or worse off. We've just moved money around, right? So the fact that money is moving around is not what generates benefit. It's whether people are receiving goods and services that make them better off. And so that's what we're after as economists when we think about what the benefits of adaptation are, the cost. It's are people gaining or losing services, goods, whatever that are of value to them that make them better off, right? And so that's what we're after, kind of measuring social welfare, and we just use money to do it. Again, broad overview. If we think about the kinds of economic values that we can gain or lose due to adaptation, total value, all the value there is, and value can either be benefit, a positive, or cost, negative. Depends on whether you gain or lose it. Market values are values for things we directly buy and sell in markets. Cars, milk, whatever, anything you can directly buy and sell in a market, any values associated with that is a market value. A non-market value is everything else. These are values for things like recreation at beaches, breathing clean air, right? Being able to live in a town where you have nice open space and can see trees, things like. Although these are things that provide value to people, but you can't buy them directly in a market, right? I can't buy, whatever, say, drinkable water in a river or lake. I can't go to a store and buy that, right? That's a non-market value. Those values are real, but they're harder to measure. Market values or non-market values can be use values, things that are linked to behavior, things that people do, right? You buy a car to drive it. You might go recreating at a beach. You might go bird watching, whatever it is, things that we can see. Non-use values is everything else. These are values typically that you might associate with something like people wanting to preserve a rare or endangered species, right? It might be something they're never going to use, but at the end of the day, I would be willing to pay to ensure the preservation of species I care about. That's an existence value. Or the fact that I want to pass things on to future generations. I want to pass on, a healthy world with healthy ecosystems. That's a bequest value. So there's a whole bunch of types of values that we have to consider when we think about an adaptation plan. And those are going to be smaller or larger in different contexts. Sometimes some of them are going to be very small. They might, in other cases, be very large. So for market goods, for things that we buy and sell, easy to measure those values, right? So economists have fairly standard methods, right? And I'm not going to go into them in too much detail, except to say that the value of a good is not the amount of money we spend to get it, right? So often, again, people make the mistake of thinking that the expenditure on a good is equal to the value of a good, and that's not necessarily true, right? Think about something that's on sale at a store, right? I see a coat on that I'm getting that's on clearance and it costs me 50 cents, right? Wow, I'm super happy about that. Why? Because my value for that coat is so much higher, right? Maybe I'd be willing to pay $200 for that coat. It's on sale for 50 cents, right? What I spend on that coat is not the same as my value for it, right? So for that reason, we can't just look at the amount of money people spend. We actually have to use estimates of demand to calculate what people's values truly are. But they're fairly standard methods. For non-market goods, it's harder, right? Because people can't buy them. We don't see that transaction in any way, shape, or form. So there's a variety of non-market valuation methods. that we use to try to trace different kinds of behavioral signals to infer what those values are. It's the same underlying economics, it's just what kind of data we use. So if we're going to think about non-market valuation methods, there's a bunch of different kinds, right? There's a whole slew of them. On the screen, I've showed a set of them, set of the most common ones. These can range from revealed preference methods, and all that means is that revealed preferences means we are looking at people's behavior out in the world. Say recreation demand models. We look at where people choose to recreate, go fishing, go to the beach, whatever it is, whatever recreation demand we're interested in, we look at how far they're willing to travel and how much they're willing to pay to get to sites as a function of, say, the environmental quality, right? And we can use that to infer values. Hedonic property values looks at patterns in residential property values, how much people are willing to pay to have a home in a particular area, again, as a function of what that area is like, right? For example, how we've done some work looking at how property values react to flood risk, right? Are people willing to pay, all else being equal, more or less for a home that happens to be at risk of flooding? And you can use that, again, to infer the values that people have for reduction in flood risk. All sorts of things, right? Defensive behavior methods, looking at behavior that people incur, for example, putting their home on stilts or building floodproofing for their home in an attempt to protect from that hazard. And again, you can use that to infer values. Those are all things that we're looking at different sorts of behavior and using different kinds of models to infer what underlying values are. Stated preference methods, these are methods that we use where there is no necessarily no observable behavior we can use, or at least of the type that we can use to quantify values. And in this case, we use specially designed survey questions that are designed to elicit those values. And I'll talk about what some of those are. And then finally, benefit transfer. Simply put, that's just a whole suite of methods where you're using results from a study somewhere else to quantify values for an area where you want it, right? So it's an approximation, and the science of benefit transfer is about effectively what are the errors that are involved when you move a value that you've estimated in one place and try to apply it somewhere else. And we know quite a bit about when those are going to be good transfers versus bad transfers. So that's all a super, super quick run through of kind of economic valuation and benefit cost analysis. And so what we've just done in about, say, 15 minutes is, what I teach my PhD students in a couple semesters of work. So we've gone through pretty quick. Given that, maybe the best way to think about this and to think about, well, what does this really mean, is to use a couple examples, right? So I'm going to show you some examples of how benefit cost analysis, how benefit and cost estimates were used in particular case studies to make judgments about whether certain options were a good idea. So the first one I'm going to show you was something we did for the state of Delaware, the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, DNREC. And they were interested in what they should do to protect a set of 7 narrow Delaware Bay beach communities. You can see that little picture down on the slide. That's a picture of one of those beach communities. And so you can see those homes are pretty high risk, right? They're sandwiched between salt marshes on the backside, a coastal lagoon, and a very narrow beach on the front end. And the state had been nourishing that beach for decades and decades, but that was pretty expensive. And so they were interested, well, what should we do, right? What's in the best economic interest of the state, right? And so they hired us to do an analysis. This is just an illustration of the project area, right? So in the Northeast U.S., this is, there's Delaware right there, and it's a portion of Delaware Bay. And there were 7 communities we looked at: Pickering Beach, Kitshummock, Slaughter, and a set of other ones. So what the economic analysis did was looked at all the potential benefits and costs, things that would be gained and lost, as a function of 4 different options that the state could do. Right, and I'll talk about what those options are. We looked at the time period from 2012 out through 2041. Actually, we started in 2011, so it was a 30-year time horizon. We looked at housing, we looked at infrastructure, we looked at natural systems, also basically everything we could think of, and we measured what were considered to be the major areas of benefits and costs. The 4 scenarios we looked at, the first was beach nourishment. In other words, you know what beach nourishment is. You put sand out, you extend the beach by basically taking sand from typically offshore, extending that beach out, and then once the beach erodes again, you then build it out again, right? So effectively, you're building up larger beaches to protect the homes and things behind it. Enhanced retreat goes the opposite direction. You get the same width of a beach as with nourishment, but instead of building the beach out, you remove the homes and go backwards, right? So that basically you get a beach by pulling out the homes that are there, or at least some of them. You pay off the homeowners, you basically buy the homes from homeowners, and then you maintain that beach backwards as the coast erodes. Basic retreat is the same idea, except with a narrower beach, right? So you're doing it with a narrower beach and removing fewer homes. And then the last option is do nothing, right? And literally that's do nothing. You just let the ocean come in, the beach erodes slowly, and then eventually those homes just flood and fall in the water. Homeowners can do what they want to try to protect them, but ultimately those homes are going to be lost, right? And you see a little picture of an area, and you can see obviously what's eventually going to happen there under the do nothing scenario. So what we did is we looked at the net benefits and costs of everything compared to the do nothing scenario. So that was our baseline. Here's an example. One of the things we measured was non-market recreational values. In other words, what is the value of having those beaches there for local recreation? And the idea is that we know from data out there and from the study we did here that people value recreation on wider beaches more. In other words, people are willing to travel further, spend more money to spend their day at a wider, nicer beach compared to a narrower beach. And so you can look at patterns of where people go, what they spend, to infer how much more they value recreation at a wider beach compared to a narrower beach. Why do we care about that? Well, because that's a measure of economic value. It's well-being. People are getting something valuable. They're having a better day at the beach, a more valuable recreation day. And so we want to capture that. That's one of the major things you might gain out of beach nourishment, is that people have a nicer beach to recreate at, and that's valuable. So these were the estimates we got. We looked at the 7 different beaches under different policies where 0 is no action. That was our default. And so you can see, for example, under beach nourishment, over all time periods, we get about $16 million of benefits just from recreation by nourishing the beach rather than doing nothing, right? So that's one of the aspects of benefits that we include. This is basically a simple table that includes everything, right? So it includes, for example, the engineering costs, sand fill and demolition. For example, if you're nourishing a beach, you got to haul in the sand, you got to put it in. That's quite expensive. Housing acquisition payments, that's just a transfer, right? The state pays those to homeowners, but that check is received by the homeowner. So that's actually just a wash, right? We included it just to demonstrate that it's just a payment from one party received by another party. Right? Recreation benefits we just talked about. Housing services, that actually reflects the periodic loss of housing value that occurs over time as homes are gradually lost, right? So that is a measure of what we truly lose. And the way we calculate that is to look at housing value and effectively realize that when you buy a home, you're buying a stream of the ability to live in that home from now until indefinitely, until you sell it. And you can use that intuition to calculate the yearly value of a home, a little bit like a rental value, right? And then we can use that to figure out how much value do we lose if that home is lost, say in 2020 or 2025 or 2030, something like that. We do the time values of that, and that's the lost housing services. That's not the cost of repairing those homes. It's not a damage cost. It's the loss of housing value. There's additional flood and erosion damages you might want to consider. And again, those are damage costs, and so we show our final net benefits with and without them, depending on whether you want to count them, right? Just for the reason we talked about before. Okay, the interesting thing is, look at that final column in yellow. Those are the net benefits, right? Benefits minus costs of those different action items, 1 through 3, compared to no action. And you notice they've all got negative signs on them, which means that they're all worse than no action. So in this particular case, the best thing you can do is absolutely nothing. You just let the water come in and you let the homes fall into the water, right? Now, when you tell people that, everyone kind of is a little surprised, right? Their mouths open, they're like, really? The best option is just to do nothing, right? And that's exactly the reaction that we got when we showed this to the state. They were really surprised because that's not a particularly politically feasible option, right? But that shows an important concept, right? That sometimes the option that truly is in the best interest of society as a whole is not something you might consider politically feasible, right? And so that shows that economic benefits and costs, they're not the only thing you want to consider, right? Turns out that doing nothing was the option that would maximize benefits to the entire state. For the people who live right in those communities, obviously, that's the worst possible option, right? And so now what you've got to do is say, okay, how do we balance what's truly in the best interest of the state with equity concerns, the fact that we really don't want to be nasty to those people who live in the communities. And so what effectively happened in that case was the state used this report as motivation to effectively get those communities to pay a greater share of protective actions, right? And so that's kind of what came out of this. But I think the take-home message is that often common wisdom can be wrong, right? I mean, a lot of times, and we see this over and over again, the option that we think is in the best economic interest of society, whether it's a community, a state, a country, often is not, right? And so the only way you can figure out what the benefits and costs are of something is to go out and measure them, right? It doesn't mean you have to spend $1 billion to measure them, but it does mean that you have to make the effort because these things aren't always obvious, right? So even if you know exactly what the biophysical outcomes are, it's not always clear what the values are. And so to show that, I want to go into my second example. And this is a case where we look at trade-offs. This was a stated preference method, what we call a choice experiment. And what a choice experiment is it's a survey-based method where you go into an area, a state, a community, whatever, and you ask people effectively to vote over different policy options that give them different things at different costs. Just the same way if you had, say, in the US, we have bond referenda, where on election day, your community may say, here, you can vote for a bond that will preserve, say, farmland and open space in your community. This is what it's going to cost you in additional taxes per year. Do you vote yes or no? And so you vote to impose costs on yourself in return for whatever that bond would pay for. This is exactly the same thing here, right? And what you do to make sure that these are consequential, to make sure people aren't just kind of making their answers up, is you then tell them truthfully that they need to be careful about their answers, because we're going to give these results straight to your community leaders. And so if you've told them that you would be really happy paying, say, $100 a year for a certain type of protection for your community, they might actually consider that when they're planning what to do. And so that creates a consequence to that survey vote. So it's not just something made up, right? It's not just people saying, oh, sure, anything, because it's just a survey. You give it a certain potential consequentiality. Just as a simple example, again, imagine that you're presenting a survey to people where there's 2 adaptation outcomes. Say maybe one is how many beach acres or beach area you have left in your community at a certain date in the future, and maybe outcome Y is how many homes are lost due to flooding or something like that, right? So you present them with the status quo. This is what happens if we do nothing, right? No additional cost to you. And then you give them one or more policy options, right? Say option A, you take actions, maybe build seawalls to protect a bunch of homes. Say, so you get Y1 homes plus an additional A increment of added homes that are protected, and say that would cost you $10 per year, right? Well, if someone is making a rational decision, a vote for option A implies that they value the protection of A homes at least $10. Otherwise, they wouldn't rationally choose that. So again, that's just kind of a cartoon example of the way these things work. So we developed these things for the case of two Connecticut communities, Waterford and Old Saybrook. I showed you a few little maps of those before. And the primary goal was to look at the trade-offs that residents would support based on their underlying values, right? If people could vote for adaptation plans and to spend their tax dollars on protecting things, what would they like to see protected and what are their values? This map just shows where those two towns are if you care about it, and you can see where they are, the two starred communities. As I said before, very different waterfronts and vulnerabilities. Old Saybrook, roughly 50% of the town floods in a Category 3 storm. In Waterford, only about 7% of the town floods. So quite different. Different populations, all sorts of different things. So you might think, oh, surveys, easy, piece of cake. You just sit on your computer, you write them up in an afternoon, you're done. Well, it's not quite that easy because to get these surveys right, you have to really understand how people are answering. So this survey actually took almost 3 years to develop, right? And the way you do it is you have a whole lot of pre-tests and focus groups where you design the survey. Well, first, even before you design the survey, you go in and you talk to people, stakeholders, town leaders, just regular residents about what they care about, what they value, what do they want to protect, what would they be willing to pay for. You talk to experts about what would actually be lost. So you go into scientists, you pull all that together and you craft your first survey that looks at what people value as well as the biophysical realities of what could be gained and lost with certain adaptation plans. You craft your questions, your voting questions, you then bring those into new focus groups, you ask people to take them, and then you walk through the surveys with everybody and you ask them, what did you think when you were answering this question? How did you understand it? You go through every single line of the survey. You then go back to the drawing board and rewrite everything because people haven't understood it the way you think they will, or people aren't taking the questions seriously, or whatever it is. You go back and you do it again and again and again and again for a few years until finally you get it right, until people understand the questions, they're making the trade-offs that reflect their values, people are understanding those scenarios, what you present to them in the same way that experts and scientists are. So it takes quite a bit of work. So that's what all goes into it. The initial focus groups, the initial research we did in those communities, identified a set of things that were the key losses and gains that people really cared about, right? At least initially, right? So things like homes that you would expect it to flood in a coastal storm of a certain intensity. Whether you're losing natural habitats like tidal marshes or beaches, the extent of the shoreline that's coastal armored with hard armoring. A lot of people, even though coastal armoring can protect things, people often don't like the way it looks, right? Some of the surveys included road flooding, obviously cost. So this is just a few panes from the survey, just to show you a little bit. It's not every page, but it's just a few of what it looked like. Those are two images from those towns. This was actually during Superstorm Sandy. So you can see that flooding's kind of a big deal in those two towns. Right? So as part of the survey on pages 3 and 4, you talk about hard and soft defenses, and you talk about why you're presenting them with these trade-offs, the same way that at least in Massachusetts and a lot of other states in the US, if there's a referendum, a vote coming up, you'll receive a little booklet in the mail that kind of tells you about what the referendum's about and why you might want to vote yay or nay for that particular thing. That's exactly the same idea here. We're describing the votes we're going to give them, and we're saying, well, here are the pros and cons, right? For example, hard defenses versus soft defenses. We show them the area of their community that's at risk during storms of different intensities. We show them just simple pictures that we developed to show them why different homes flood in different intensity storms. And what goes into those pictures were determined by our focus group results. And then we give them then we show them the structure of our voting choices, right? Here are the things that are going to vary depending on what you vote for. For example, the percentage of homes in your town that are expected to flood in a Category 3 storm, a mid-intensity hurricane. The percentage of wetlands in your community that will be lost by the mid-2020s, again, under no action, or if you take adaptation actions. Beaches and dunes lost, seawalls and coastal armoring. And these were basically informed by the process I just talked about before. And then we give people a sequence. There was actually 72 of these different options, like the example question shows one. And each person that received the survey booklet in the mail saw 3 of those. So there were 24 unique survey booklets that basically took those 70 whatever, the 72 choice different questions and split them up 3 questions per booklet. So, for example, the little circle thing, that's the no option. That's what happens if you do nothing, spend no more tax dollars. Option A and B show, in this case, these are 2 different questions, possible options that you could vote for. And if you vote for one of those, you're voting to spend a certain amount of money for a certain set of outcomes. And things can go up or down, right? For example, you can protect for some options that do a really good job of protecting beaches, like option B for Old Saybrook that we're looking at here. You actually are protecting, your beaches are lost, right? So that's really bad for beaches. So you're losing a lot of beaches. Sorry, I reversed it. But you're actually protecting a lot of homes, right? And so things don't always get better. They can get better or worse. And by looking at how people vote to spend money for those different options, you can triangulate in on their values. How much is each home flooded worth, how much is preventing each home flooded worth? Road miles flooded. It turns out that I'm going to show you the model without road miles flooded because people really didn't care very much about road miles in our final analysis. Okay, so just background stuff. So we developed 2 independent surveys for each community. These were implemented in 2014, sent it out to roughly 3,000 people, and of those, about 2,500 were deliverable, right? You get certain back because the addresses are bad. And we got about 1/3 of our surveys came back, right? Roughly 32.2%, right? And that's kind of good, right? If you know anything about response rates in this day and age, typical response rates for surveys are, less than 5%, right? So anytime you get somewhere over 30%, that means that people really took the survey seriously and thought it was an important issue. So that's kind of one good indication that at least all that survey design effort paid off. Okay, kind of cutting to the chase because we're running a little bit out of time, right? So this is willings to pay. This basically says how much would people be willing to pay or vote for to increase their taxes each year to protect a certain amount of each of these things, right? So for example, for wetlands, the typical town resident in Waterford would be willing to pay $12.53 in additional tax dollars per year to protect each additional acre of wetland from loss, right? And $18.83 for each additional beach acre protected. So right there, you see that protecting beaches is a bit more valuable than protecting wetlands in that town, right? You look at Old Saybrook, on the other hand, right? All of a sudden, wetlands, those little stars mean they're statistically significant. In other words, we can say with a high degree of certainty that it's not equal to 0. Wetlands, it's $1.28 per acre. So what's going on there? Why is that so small? Well, it turns out it's because Old Saybrook has a whole lot of wetlands, right? 477 acres of wetlands compared to a much smaller number, I think maybe 30 in Waterford. Because there's so many more wetlands in Old Saybrook, each acre just isn't worth as much, kind of diminishing marginal returns. The more you have of something, the less that last unit is worth. So Old Saybrook residents, because they have so many wetlands, each acre isn't worth quite as much. But beaches, they don't have as many of, so they care quite a bit about that. Now, interestingly, turns out that seawalls, although the model it used will give you a number for no matter what you put in it, but notice there's no statistical significance stars there. That basically means we can't say with any degree of certainty that number is different from 0. So effectively, we have to assume that that's 0, right? Even though the cardinal numbers are what they are, we can't prove that value is real. Now look at homes. So for homes, what we find is in Waterford, that's not significant. That's effectively 0. So what it tells us is that when Waterford residents were deciding what to vote for, the amount of homes protected was not important at all. For the typical person, it didn't factor in. For Old Saybrook, it factored in, but protecting each home is worth pretty negligible amount, 19 cents per year per home, right? Now, when I show this to people, right, including when we showed this to the town government in Waterford and Old Saybrook, right, they're always surprised at that, right? Because what they think is, oh my God, people value home protection more than anything, right? And it turns out this is one of those surprises, right? It turns out that obviously people value protection of their own home quite a lot, right? But this isn't people voting for their own home. This is people voting for protection of large numbers of homes across the community. These are typically other people's homes. And if you look at, and if you talk to Old Saybrook residents or Waterford residents, basically what they tell you is, look, these homes that are flooding, they're owned by wealthy people who chose to buy homes in a flood zone, right? This is their business, right? It's their value. It's not mine. I don't want to spend my tax dollars protecting other people's homes who chose to buy homes in risky areas. As a result, those values are quite low, right? So that shows you the difference between public values, what people are really willing to pay for, versus the kind of private value that some person might care about. The other thing to keep in mind is that when public officials see people in say, town meetings, that's where they're getting their information. And think about who shows up at town meetings. It's the people with a lot to lose. It's that small number of people who have a big home on the beach that's at risk. So they're going to show up at a town meeting every week and make a lot of noise about how their home is valuable and needs to be protected. All those people who don't live in a flood zone, who are protected, who aren't at risk, but who don't really want to pay taxes to protect those homes, they're not showing up at their town meetings. And so their values, their town leaders aren't hearing those values. And so what happens is there's a difference between the values you would estimate if you actually go out and try to measure them for the typical person in that town, what the values actually are, and what politicians or town leaders sometimes think those values are, right? And in fact, when we went into these towns to begin with, we talked to a lot of the town leaders, the town managers, the mayors, and in both cases, they said, we don't even know why you're doing this study because we already know what people care about. We know that people care about protecting homes and roads, and that's it, right? The values for beaches and wetlands, it's just not going to be that much. And it turns out that they were exactly wrong. The results were exactly the opposite. What people really, really wanted to spend their money protecting was beaches where they go and where they'd gone since they were children, and the wetlands that give their culture, their community, the character and the wildlife that they value. They really didn't want to spend any more money protecting other people's homes. So, kind of shows you some of the things you can do with this. Another thing you can do is you can calculate trade-offs, right? So, for example, maybe you don't care about those money values, but maybe you care about, for example, how many beach acres you would have to protect to make it worthwhile to lose a wetland acre. Right? What's that trade-off, right? And it turns out it's about 1.5, right? So you can do that as well, right? And again, I already mentioned this, but so the underpinning all of this is understanding really what public values are, right? Economic values, benefits or costs, at their core reflect values that people have, trade-offs that people are willing to make. Those can be companies or they can be individual households, one way or the other. It's all value. But those aren't necessarily reflected always in market transactions, right? And so you really have to get in and measure them. You can't typically rely just on these kind of, for example, the kind of damage cost models that FEMA runs that just say, okay, here's the number of homes that would be hit by a flood and here's what it costs to repair them. Easy to calculate, not very good at telling you what is in the best interest of society. So, I've kind of gone through a whole lot of that. Hopefully it was useful. And again, economic benefits and costs aren't the only thing you want to consider, right? There's a lot, I think of all the tools in your toolbox that you're going to use to decide what to do, economic benefits and costs are one, right? They might be the wrench. You also want to consider other things, equity, maybe political feasibility, maybe things that you can get loans for versus not. There's all sorts of things that you might want to consider when deciding what's socially best. But one of them is deciding for which ones the net benefits are greatest, for which one will provide the greatest economic benefit to society, right? And again, that's not always, in fact, it's very frequently not often related to the option that will generate the most economic activity. So when used correctly, economics can help identify those sorts of things, can help identify the trade-offs that are optimal from society's perspective, or you can look at different groups within society, right? You don't have to look at a whole town. You can look at people who live in different areas, or you can even go household by household, right, if you want. And by doing this, you can at least make your decisions based on objective information, not based on what you think those benefits and costs might be, which usually is quite far off from what we've seen. And the final thing I just want to emphasize is that it's really important to consider the full range of economic benefits and costs, not only those that are easy to observe, because sometimes the hardest to measure things are the things that
thank you so much for that presentation.
And so that
we have 15 minutes for questions, so you can either do that by activating your microphone or
anything you want.
Chat, which is available on the lower right-hand corner. So just a refresher, if you want to connect your microphone, you have to click the little phone icon on the top leftish corner. Or again, you can type any questions in the chat.
Or I might have just silenced the room.
Oh, so we have a question from John Somerville, which is, have any of the communities started planning using this research?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's I can talk about both cases. The first is the Delaware case, and that information went. It was a study that was directly commissioned by the state, and so that was used directly, right? So that went before the legislature. It was debated quite a bit, and then essentially, as I mentioned, what they did was they effectively started charging those communities and the people who lived in those communities a greater portion of the cost for nourishing those beaches, right? So that they decided that it wasn't politically feasible to do nothing, but based on that, they used that information to basically to make the point that those communities were effectively being subsidized by the rest of the state, that the housing benefits and recreational benefits that were received almost exclusively by those seven communities were being paid by other people, and so they used that to effectively to develop a transfer so that it wasn't quite so inequitable for people elsewhere in the state. So that's how that was used. For the Waterford and Old Saybrook, what that was done, or how those played in, was each of those communities, we chose those communities because they were engaged in active coastal adaptation working groups in coordination with the Nature Conservancy. And so one of our investigators, Adam Welcher, was part of the Nature Conservancy and was basically kind of coordinating those efforts in the local towns. And so the way the results were used was these were then presented to those coastal adaptation working groups, and and what was done was, so these results weren't designed to say this is exactly what you should do. They were designed to figure out where towns should place their priority, right? So should they give greater priority to built stuff or natural stuff? And as a result, and this was one of a variety of pieces of evidence that encouraged both communities to give greater emphasis to protection of their natural assets. And so that was how those pieces of evidence were used. Because it went into a whole planning process, right? So there was a whole bunch of pieces of evidence. I can't point to it and say, okay, this was exactly what was done because of this, say, survey or choice experiment. But what we can do is to look at how it played into the overall dialogue. And basically what came out of it was much greater emphasis on the natural assets and ecosystem services.
We have another question in the chat, which
essentially
is,
realizing
have cost of emergency measures been incorporated into this kind of analysis, cost of rescuing people from isolated locations, etc., under disaster conditions?
You certainly can. I mean, the two that I showed, we did not integrate vacuation costs in the DENREC case because it wasn't that large compared to other things. That was one of the things we talked about was, well, should we consider evacuation costs in that case? And it turns out that because of various issues, they just weren't large enough to consider in that case. In the Connecticut case, we didn't consider them. You certainly could, right? So that if there's a circumstance where, for example, a community has decided we will evacuate people, right? If they're cut off, then yeah, for sure, right? And that fortunately, it's not that hard to include those evacuation costs because you can pretty much estimate what they are, right? So for sure, right? If you're doing a full cost benefit analysis and there are evacuation costs that will be incurred, yes, that's a legitimate cost, and you can easily just add those in to any of the types of things that I showed here. Yes, so for sure. We haven't done it here, but those are generally pretty easy to estimate, and yeah, you can do that. Another thing, just really quickly, is that one of the things that you also would so for example, their health or something like that is threatened. That's another cost that you would want to calculate, right? So for example, if people are at risk of dying, mortality or morbidity, there are pretty standard methods to calculate those, right? So there's something called the value of a statistic of life, which says that if on average, probabilistically, you can predict that under such and such type of a storm, this number of people is expected to be harmed or sadly to lose their lives. Again, those are things that can be built in the same way that say you would use if you were predicting the benefits of pollution reduction, where you're going to reduce cancer deaths, right? It's exactly the same process. And so in addition to evacuation costs, you would also want to consider any remaining costs of damages of health and life damages. Let's see if I can.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Reminder that you can use your microphone or you can type them in the chat.
That's a fantastic question, right? So the conditions, so there's a couple conditions. The first is in certain types of government situations, for example, federal governments often are like this in the U.S. and elsewhere. Um, they're mandated to conduct benefit cost analysis, right? And so in that sort of case, they they have to do valuation at least of a certain case because, for example, statute or regulation mandates that they do a benefit cost analysis. So 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 that's that's an obvious case where there would be an effective use of valuation studies, and a lot of the kinds of studies that I've showed you and others have, for example, played directly into benefit cost analysis at the federal level in the U.S. At the state and community level, it's a little more varied, and there I think the effective use really depends on the extent to which people are making policy based on kind of underlying welfare circumstances. If they really care about optimizing, whatever benefits and cost, if they really care about things like whether people value their local beach, right? Or so for some people, they come into the situation with a very narrow view of economics. They think of economics as just economic activity, GDP, and no matter what economists tell them, that's they come into that. And for those kinds of individuals and situations, you can present non-market or other valuation results, and it's just not going to have very much traction, right? But in other cases, for example, these have been very useful where you present results at a community level, and community residents are often quite interested in that. And so if you use these from a bottom-up approach, very often that can link valuation results with the kind of, say, political interest or political pressure to get things done. So for example, now community residents will say, oh, well, I always knew that I wanted to protect my beach. I didn't know that there was a real value associated with that. So now I have the leverage to go to the community leaders who I care about and demand that they actually take some action to protect that beach, right? That's just a cartoon example. So it kind of varies, right? But increasingly we're seeing that particularly with concepts such as ecosystem services, right? The idea that nature provides benefits to people, as that becomes more widely accepted, people are more interested and more open to the idea that, wait a minute, an economic benefit isn't just a dollar changing hands, that I get benefits from all sorts of things that are worth protecting. So when I first started doing this in the late 80s, it was actually really, really hard to get any sort of traction with these, right? People would kind of nod and smile and say, oh, that's nice. Now we're getting a whole lot of traction with these, and people are and what we're seeing is communities, nonprofit organizations, governments, whatever, are actively coming out seeking these numbers because they want to know what these values are to inform both their decisions, but also for advocacy purposes, right? There's a lot of value for these. In a lot of cases, nonprofit organizations want them because they want to be able to make the point that it's not just about protecting built stuff, right? That nature has value, right? So that's kind of a rambling answer, but hopefully that said something useful.
Great. So we only have about 1 minute left from our allotted time. I see a couple of people typing right now. So hopefully it will be a short question.
Hopefully. One of them was a thank you,
Frank
and then
was
there was
typing.
someone else. Frank Johnston was typing, but is now not typing. Frank Johnston with a good last name.
There you go. So we have a question from Frank that says, does green infrastructure equate to natural capital?
Yes, green infrastructure is a type of natural capital.